The morning of November 8, 1943, Philippine Sea, about 200 miles east of Manila. Commander Dudley Walker Morton stood in the conning tower of USS Wahoo, his gaze locked on the periscope. Through the gray dawn haze, a Japanese convoy emerged. 7 heavily laden merchant ships, flanked by 2 destroyers. Morton could see the rising sun flags snapping in the wind and the rust streaks along hulls that had endured too many voyages without proper care. The convoy steamed at 8 knots, zigzagging in a pattern Morton had studied for months. He turned to his executive officer, speaking words that would echo in submarine wardrooms across the Pacific. "We're going in. Surface attack. All ahead flank." What Morton couldn't yet know, and what no American submarine commander patrolling the Pacific fully grasped, was that they were about to conduct the most successful unrestricted submarine campaign in naval history. A campaign that would sink over 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, starving Japan's war machine more effectively than any bombing raid or surface battle. And it would be carried out primarily by a single class of submarine, the Gato class. Its modest designation and specifications belied what would become the deadliest submarine design deployed in sustained combat. In Tokyo, Japanese Admiral T and his staff at headquarters overlooking the Imperial Palace operated under assumptions that seemed unshakable in 1943. Intelligence compiled by the Fourth Fleet and distributed to convoy commanders assessed American submarine capabilities as modest at best. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through decades of study and combat experience stretching back to the Russo-Japanese War, viewed submarines as reconnaissance vessels and opportunistic raiders. Dangerous, yes, but manageable with proper escort procedures and aggressive anti-submarine warfare. The idea that submarines alone could sever Japan's maritime supply lines, achieving what surface fleets and air power combined had failed to accomplish, seemed to contradict everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned about modern warfare. This confidence rested on experience. During World War I, German U-boats had wreaked havoc on Allied shipping, but ultimately failed to starve Britain into submission. Convoy systems, improved depth charges, and better detection had rendered unrestricted submarine warfare a failed strategy by 1918. In the early years of World War II, German U-boats in the Atlantic achieved impressive tonnage figures, but at unsustainable costs in submarines and crews. By 1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare had evolved to the point where U-boat losses outpaced production. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning against Germany's submarine force. Japanese planners studying these lessons concluded that submarines were a serious but containable threat. Their merchant marine could be protected with armed escorts, convoy procedures, aggressive depth charges, and coastal air patrols. What Japanese Admiral T and his intelligence officers failed to grasp was that the Pacific War would be different in every meaningful way. Part 2. Japanese Naval Doctrine. In 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to commerce protection reflected decades of offensive-minded thinking. Since Admiral Togo's decisive victory at Tsushima Strait in 1905, where the Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet, the doctrine focused almost exclusively on the decisive battle. The concept was simple: build the most powerful battleships, train the most skilled crews, and achieve victory through a single climactic engagement that would crush the enemy's will to fight. Everything else, convoy escorts, anti-submarine warfare, merchant marine protection, was secondary. This bias toward offense had catastrophic consequences. Japanese destroyer captains, trained as fleet scouts and torpedo attack specialists, often considered escort duty beneath their dignity. When assigned to convoy protection, they performed the mission with minimal enthusiasm and preparation. Japanese anti-submarine tactics in 1943 remained largely unchanged from the 1920s. Depth charge patterns were predictable, sonar equipment, called hydrophones by Japanese operators, was inferior to Allied systems, and naval aviators received almost no training in anti-submarine patrols. To commanders dreaming of replicating Togo's triumph at Tsushima, using valuable aircraft and skilled pilots to hunt submarines seemed wasteful. The Japanese merchant marine, which carried the raw materials and fuel sustaining Japan's war effort, operated under peacetime assumptions well into 1944. Many captains refused to sail in convoy, viewing it as an inefficient constraint on autonomy. Those who did often broke formation at night or in bad weather, trusting the vast Pacific distances for protection. Merchant ships rarely had military-grade radios. Communication often relied on signal flags and Aldous lamps, making coordinated evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. Most ships carried no weapons, and those that did typically mounted a single machine gun or outdated deck gun, manned by minimally trained crew. Institutional contempt for merchant marine protection ran deep. At the Naval War College in Tokyo, where future admirals studied strategy and tactics, no course addressed convoy protection or anti-submarine warfare as primary subjects. The curriculum focused on battleship tactics, carrier operations, and torpedo attacks. Merchant shipping appeared only as logistical background, necessary but unglamorous. This produced a generation of officers who could calculate gun ranges and torpedo spreads precisely, yet could not grasp that oil tankers and iron ore carriers were more strategically important than battleships. Part 3. The Japanese Merchant Marine Reality. In December 1941, when war began, the Japanese merchant marine totaled about 6 million tons of shipping. This included everything from modern 10,000-ton tankers to ancient coastal freighters that had sailed Asian waters since before World War I. The fleet was diverse but aging. Most ships had been built in the 1920s and early 1930s. Fuel efficiency lagged behind Western standards, and maintenance had been postponed throughout the 1930s as Japan's economy militarized. Many vessels sailed with mechanical issues that would have grounded them under peacetime safety rules. Japan's geography created total dependence on this merchant fleet. The home islands had almost no oil, limited coal insufficient for industrial warfare, scarce iron ore, no natural rubber, no bauxite for aluminum production, and food production that could feed only about 70% of the population under ideal conditions. Everything else, the petroleum fueling ships and aircraft, the iron for steel, the rice feeding soldiers, the rubber for vehicle tires, had to be imported by sea from conquered territories in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. The logistics were staggering. A single Japanese army division fighting in Burma or the Philippines needed roughly 3,000 tons of supplies per month. The combined fleet, battleships and carriers, consumed thousands of barrels of fuel daily. Aircraft factories required steady flows of aluminum, rubber, and aviation fuel. Civilian populations needed food imports to avoid famine. All of this had to cross thousands of miles of ocean, distances that grew longer as American forces advanced westward. Japanese planners in 1941 calculated shipping needs carefully. They estimated Japan required roughly 3 million tons of merchant shipping actively operating at any given time to sustain both military operations and minimal civilian needs. The 6 million ton fleet seemed to provide comfortable redundancy, enough to cover vessels under repair, losses to accidents and storms, and anticipated war losses. The calculations assumed modest attrition based on World War I experience, about 300,000 tons lost annually, easily replaced through Japan's shipbuilding industry. These calculations, prepared by staff officers who understood logistics better than most naval officers, were presented to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo in late 1941. They included specific warnings. If merchant ship losses exceeded shipbuilding capacity, if the merchant fleet fell below critical thresholds, Japan's ability to continue fighting would be compromised, regardless of battle outcomes. The warnings were noted, filed, and essentially ignored. Japanese naval leadership in 1941 planned to win the war through decisive carrier and battleship engagements, not through the unglamorous arithmetic of merchant tonnage and replacement rates. The idea that American submarines, operating alone without surface fleet or massive air support, could sink enough merchant ships to strangle Japan's war economy seemed implausible. Submarines were dangerous, yes, but not war-winning weapons, or so Japanese. Admirals believed in December 1941, when the war was still young and victory seemed inevitable. Statistics began arriving at the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo during spring 1942, typed on thin rice paper by junior officers who didn't fully grasp the number's significance. March losses: 42 merchant ships, totaling 132,000 tons. April, 31 ships, 106,000 tons. May, 47 ships, 168,000 tons. The junior officers, working in cramped offices, smelling of cigarette smoke carried on humid breezes from Tokyo Bay, noted the figures dutifully, but without alarm. War meant losses. Ships struck mines, weathered storms, suffered mechanical failures. Losses to enemy submarines were expected. What these officers couldn't see, and what their superiors refused to acknowledge, was the emerging pattern. American submarines were learning. Each patrol refined their tactics. Commanders who survived early war patrols returned with knowledge of Japanese convoy routes, escort procedures, and weaknesses. The initial caution of 1942 operations gave way to aggressive confidence. Commander Morton on Wahoo, Commander Sam Dye on Harder, Commander Richard O'Kane on Tang. They were developing hunting techniques that would be studied for generations. The Gato-class submarines that executed these attacks were purpose-built for Pacific warfare, unlike German U-boats. Each Gato measured 300 feet in length, displaced the 1,500 tons on the surface, and carried 80 officers and enlisted men. Specifications seemed modest compared to larger, faster Japanese fleet submarines, but the Gatos had hidden advantages. They could dive to 300 feet, 100 feet deeper than Japanese submarines, providing crucial escape depth from destroyers. Their diesel engines, built by General Motors and Fairbanks Morse, were exceptionally reliable. Most importantly, their 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft, allowed sustained attacks without surfacing. Each Gato carried 24 torpedoes, giving 24 chances to sink Japanese shipping before returning to Pearl Harbor or Fremantle for resupply. By September 1942, American submarines had sunk 93 Japanese merchant ships. By December, the total reached 134 ships, nearly 600,000 tons. These figures circulated among senior Japanese naval officers, but were routinely dismissed as exaggerations or misattributed. Ships reported sunk by submarines had sometimes struck mines, fallen victim to air attacks, or been counted multiple times due to reporting errors. Early war submarines did face torpedo problems. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard for the fleet, had 2 major defects. The magnetic exploder often misfired or failed, while the contact exploder sometimes failed on direct hits, crushing the firing pin instead of detonating. Submarine commanders filed repeated complaints, noting torpedoes ran under targets, struck hulls without exploding, or even circled back toward the firing submarine. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, staffed by officers never, under fire, insisted the torpedoes were perfect and blamed the submarine commanders. The crisis wasn't fully resolved until late 1943, when commanders disabled magnetic exploders and field-modified contact detonators. Even with defective torpedoes, American submarines were sinking Japanese shipping faster than Japan's shipyards could replace it. Japanese shipyards in 1942 produced about 600,000 tons of new merchant shipping, while losses totaled 980,000 tons. The resulting gap of 380,000 tons came directly from Japan's maritime reserve. The comfortable redundancy that Japanese planners had calculated in 1941 was vanishing. Yet Admiralty, still fixated on carrier battles and battleship engagements and dreaming of a decisive Tsushima-style victory, barely noticed the arithmetic of national strangulation. Commander Dudley Walker Morton returned USS Wahoo to Pearl Harbor in February 1943 after a patrol that Submarine Force Headquarters would later classify as the most aggressive ever conducted. In 3 weeks, Morton had sunk 9 Japanese ships totaling 20,000 tons. He attacked convoys in shallow waters where Japanese commanders assumed submarines could not operate. He launched surface gun attacks against small vessels, conserving torpedoes for larger targets. Most audaciously, he penetrated Wewak Harbor on New Guinea's northern coast, a supposedly protected anchorage guarded by shore batteries and air patrols, and fired all remaining torpedoes at anchored transports before escaping at flank speed. While Japanese destroyers scrambled to pursue, Morton's patrol report, typed on flimsy paper still preserved in naval archives, described actions that seemed reckless to older commanders but revolutionary to younger officers studying his tactics. Morton stayed on the surface whenever possible, using Wahoo's superior speed to outmaneuver escorts. He attacked at dawn and dusk when changing light impaired Japanese lookouts, closing to point-blank range, sometimes under 1,000 yards, where torpedo run time was measured in seconds, and escorts could not depress guns enough to target Wahoo's low profile. Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who would later command his own submarine and become the highest-scoring American submarine ace, called Morton's approach aggressive to the point of madness, but it was madness that worked. By March 1943, Japanese convoy commanders in the Southwest Pacific reported that American submarines no longer followed expected patterns. Submarines attacked in daylight, multiple times during a single convoy passage, and in shallow coastal waters where diving to escape depth charges was supposedly impossible. These reports, transmitted by radio to 4th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul and forwarded to Tokyo, described tactics that violated decades of established doctrine. Japanese anti-submarine procedures assumed submarines were cautious, firing one spread of torpedoes from maximum range before diving, deep to retreat. Morton and his peers proved submarines could be surface raiders, aggressive hunters pressing attacks until all torpedoes were expended. The evidence demanding a fundamental reassessment of convoy protection reached Japanese naval headquarters in May 1943. That month, American submarines sank 36 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 129,000 tons. Critically, 3 major troop convoys bound for New Guinea were intercepted and devastated. The transport Kikuzuki Maru, carrying 200 troops from Shanghai to Rabaul, was torpedoed by USS Trigger and sank in 9 minutes, drowning 800 soldiers. The Buenos Aires Maru, loaded with aviation supplies and engineering equipment for Solomon Islands airfields, was hit by 3 torpedoes from USS Guardfish and exploded when aviation fuel ignited. The Australia Maru, carrying replacement pilots for Japanese naval air groups in the South Pacific, was torpedoed by USS Gurnard off Bougainville, killing 392 men, including 53 trained carrier pilots whose replacements had taken 2 years to train and required resources Japan could not spare. These were not random civilian cargo ships. They were critical military transports carrying troops and equipment desperately needed by Japanese commanders. The loss of ships was serious. The loss of trained men, soldiers who had completed months of training, pilots with thousands of hours of flight instruction, and precious aviation fuel was catastrophic. And these losses occurred despite prescribed escort procedures. All 3 transports had destroyer escorts, zigzagged according to official patterns, and sailed in waters supposedly patrolled by Japanese aircraft. None of it mattered. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, finally receiving reports of these losses, began to comprehend that American submarines were unlike the opportunistic raiders of Japanese doctrine. These were not reconnaissance vessels making occasional attacks. They were dedicated commerce raiders systematically severing Japan's maritime supply lines. The American submarine force was small by surface Navy standards, fewer than 200 operational boats, but they were in the right ocean, built for long-range patrols, manned by volunteer crews with superior training, and commanded by officers developing tactics specifically designed to destroy merchant shipping. Commander Morton's aggressive methods, once considered reckless by conservative leadership, were being adopted throughout the Pacific. Hunting techniques he demonstrated on Wahoo, aggressive surface attacks, and point-blank torpedo shots were becoming standard. By June 1943, the arithmetic Japanese planners had warned about in 1941 was undeniable. Japan's merchant fleet, which had totaled 6 million tons at the war's start, had dropped to 4.8 million tons. Losses accelerated: June, 33 ships, 122,000 tons; July, 39 ships, 157,000 tons; August, 29 ships, 147,000 tons. Japanese shipyards, constrained by steel allocations competing with warship construction and army production, produced roughly 70,000 tons of new merchant shipping monthly. Losses averaged 140,000 tons monthly, leaving a gap of 70,000 tons every 30 days, shipping capacity that could never be recovered. The impact on military operations was immediate. Army divisions fighting in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands reported chronic shortages of ammunition and food. Units that should have received 3,000 tons of supplies per month received 1,500 tons or less. Soldiers subsisted on 1,200 calories daily, half the ration of troops in China. Artillery batteries conserved shells, firing only at confirmed targets. Small arms ammunition was rationed, and soldiers joked bitterly about being issued 3 rounds per day, one for the enemy, one for themselves if captured, and one to trade for food with locals. The naval situation was even worse. Battleships and carriers consumed massive quantities of fuel oil. Each sortie burned thousands of barrels of precious petroleum. Japan's mobile fleet, its primary carrier striking force, needed roughly 40,000 barrels of fuel monthly just to maintain training operations. Combat operations doubled or tripled that consumption. All oil had to come from refineries in the Dutch East Indies and Borneo, transported by tanker across thousands of miles, patrolled relentlessly by American submarines. By August 1943, Japanese naval planners were calculating fuel reserves in weeks rather than months. Major fleet operations now had to be approved by Tokyo headquarters based on available fuel. Admirals commanding powerful carrier divisions found themselves unable to conduct combat operations because tankers carrying fuel to forward bases had been sunk by American submarines. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers exceeded the material losses. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built on assumptions of technical superiority and tactical excellence. Japanese destroyers were faster than their American counterparts. Torpedoes were more powerful. Night fighting doctrine was superior. These beliefs had been reinforced by victories throughout 1942. But submarines operated in an entirely different realm, where traditional naval advantages were meaningless. Destroyers could not outrun submarines attacking from ambush. Torpedoes could not strike submerged targets. Night fighting skills were useless against enemies striking invisibly from beneath the waves. American submarines were negating every advantage Japanese naval forces had trained for decades to exploit. Staff officers in Tokyo, reviewing loss reports through the summer of 1943, began including language in intelligence summaries that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Terms like merchant shipping situation, critical and maritime supply lines, threatened appeared in documents circulated to senior commanders. Recommendations for fundamental changes in convoy procedures, including dedicating significant destroyer strength to escort duty and withdrawing experienced destroyer commanders from offensive operations to train convoy protection specialists, were drafted and submitted to the Naval General Staff. Most were rejected or only half-heartedly implemented. The institutional bias toward offensive operations remained too strong. Japanese admirals in mid-1943 were still planning for the decisive battle that would end the war, still believing that destroying the American Pacific Fleet in a single climactic engagement would render merchant shipping protection unnecessary. But the numbers told a different story. Between December 1941 and September 1943, American submarines had sunk roughly 350 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 1.44 million tons. The Gato-class submarines, those unassuming vessels with modest specifications, were achieving what carrier raids and surface battles had not. They were severing Japan's access to the resources sustaining industrial warfare, starving the Japanese war machine one tanker and one freighter at a time. And they were accomplishing this with a force never exceeding 60 submarines on patrol at once. Commander Morton would not live to see the final victory. Wahoo was lost with all hands during a patrol in the Sea of Japan in October 1943. Yet the tactics Morton pioneered, the aggressive methods once deemed reckless by conservative commanders, were adopted throughout the American submarine force in the Pacific. The toll would continue rising through 1944 and 1945 until Japanese merchant shipping virtually ceased to exist, and Japan's ability to fight collapsed, not from battlefield defeats, but from the inability to transport fuel, food, and raw materials critical to modern warfare. By January 1944, the Japanese merchant marine was in systematic collapse. Operational tonnage had fallen below 4 million tons, the minimum threshold Japanese logistical planners had identified in 1941 for sustaining military operations and civilian survival. Remaining ships were increasingly old and poorly maintained, pulled from coastal routes and pressed into long-distance convoy duty. Crews were inexperienced replacements, civilian sailors accustomed to fishing boats or small cargo vessels, now navigating thousand-mile routes through submarine-infested waters. The institutional knowledge that had sustained Japan's merchant marine through decades of peacetime operations, the experienced captains who understood weather and navigation, the chief engineers who coaxed maximum performance from aging engines, was being lost faster than replacements could be trained. Japanese admirals' response revealed how the institutional bias toward offensive operations had compromised rational strategic thinking. In February 1944, with merchant shipping losses averaging 200,000 tons monthly, the Naval General Staff approved construction plans for the Yamato-class battleship Shinano, converting its hull into an aircraft carrier. The project required 12,000 tons of steel and 18 months of construction. Those resources could have produced 30 cargo vessels or 15 tankers, yet the battleship mentality remained dominant. Japanese admirals were still planning for the climactic surface engagement that would justify every strategic decision made since Tsushima in 1905. The human cost of this institutional failure was staggering. Merchant sailors on Japanese cargo ships in 1944 faced mortality rates exceeding frontline infantry units. Ships sailed undermanned as qualified sailors became scarce. Those aboard often lacked basic survival equipment, lifeboats were missing or poorly maintained, life preservers rotted and ineffective, and radios, when present, often failed. Ships torpedoed at night in the open Pacific left survivors adrift in darkness, without distress signals, without hope of rescue, waiting for death from exposure or sharks. The tanker Kyokui Maru, torpedoed by USS Pogi in March 1944 while carrying aviation fuel from Borneo to the Philippines, illustrated the cascading consequences of inadequate protection. The ship sank in 4 minutes after a single torpedo struck the forward fuel tanks, igniting a fireball visible for 20 miles. 43 crew members died instantly. The remaining 28, floating in fuel-contaminated water, were not rescued. Japanese escorts, following doctrine prioritizing the hunt for the attacking submarine over rescuing survivors, spent 6 hours dropping depth charges in a futile pursuit of Pogi. By the time destroyers returned, all had drowned or died from fuel inhalation. The 6,000 barrels of aviation fuel aboard, enough to sustain Philippine air operations for 2 weeks, were lost. The experienced merchant crew, representing decades of maritime knowledge, was gone. The ship itself, a modern 1939-built tanker, was gone. All this loss resulted from a decision to pursue a submarine that escaped undamaged. Intelligence reports reaching American submarine headquarters in Pearl Harbor during spring 1944 confirmed Japan's merchant shipping was in terminal decline. Convoy routes were abandoned. Critical supply runs to forward bases were canceled due to lack of available ships. The Southern Resource Area, the conquered territories in Southeast Asia, and the Dutch East Indies, intended to supply Japan with oil and raw materials, was becoming economically useless, as nothing could transport those resources to the home islands. Oil sat idle in storage tanks across Borneo. Iron ore piled up on docks in Malaya. Rubber rotted in Singapore warehouses. All of it was useless because the ships that should have transported these materials to Japanese factories were lying on the Pacific floor, sunk by Gato-class submarines whose crews would never know the strategic impact of their patrols. Post-war assessments by naval historians revealed the unprecedented scale of the American submarine campaign. Between December 1941 and August 1945, American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5,120,000 tons. Roughly 60% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. They also sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. Yet it was the merchant shipping losses that represented the submarine force's most decisive contribution. The Gato-class submarines, the workhorses of the Pacific campaign, accounted for the majority of these sinkings. 77 Gato boats were commissioned between 1941 and 1943, conducting roughly 1,500 war patrols collectively, operating from bases in Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, Brisbane, and later from the Philippines and Marianas. They patrolled waters from the Aleutians to the Java Sea, from Japan's home islands to the Indian Ocean. 19 Gato boats were lost, a sobering 25% casualty rate, but far lower than the 80% suffered by German U-boats in the Atlantic. The human cost on both sides told stories numbers alone could not capture. The American submarine force lost 3,505 officers and men, roughly 22% of all personnel who served, killed in ways that left no bodies to recover. They died when depth charges crushed hulls at 400 feet, when torpedo explosions broke boats in half, when Japanese aircraft bombed surface submarines into fragments. The submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service during World War II. Yet volunteers knew the risks and served regardless. Japanese merchant sailor casualties exceeded 100,000. Most deaths occurred far from home, in waters thousands of miles from Japan, witnessed only by fellow sailors. Few merchant sailors have known graves, their bodies rest among wreckage scattered across the Pacific. The Japanese naval leadership's institutional contempt for merchant marine protection extended even to record keeping. Many ship losses were never formally documented. Crews simply disappeared, ships never reached port. Families were notified only that their sons or husbands were missing, presumed lost at sea, with no details of when, where, or how. The economic impact of the submarine campaign was decisive. By mid-1945, Japan's oil imports had fallen to roughly 7% of 1941 levels. Steel production declined by 60%, and food imports had ceased, causing widespread urban malnutrition. The combined fleet, dominant in 1942, remained largely in port, not due to battle damage, but because fuel could not reach naval bases. Yamato and Musashi, symbols of Japanese naval power, conducted their final operations on one-way fuel loads. Japan could not supply enough oil for round trips. The irony, noted by Japanese naval historians post-war, was stark. Submarines, dismissed by doctrine as secondary to battleships and carriers, proved far more strategically decisive. Yamato-class battleships, each costing as much as 1,000 merchant ships, achieved nothing of strategic significance before being sunk by American aircraft. Gato-class submarines, built for a fraction of a battleship's cost, strangled Japan's war economy and made further resistance materially impossible. The climactic battle Japanese admirals had envisioned since Tsushima never occurred. Victory came instead through the unglamorous arithmetic of tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, through patient patrols of submarines enduring weeks of boredom punctuated by minutes of terror, a campaign that validated every warning Japanese logistical planners had issued in 1941, which naval leadership had ignored. Commander Dudley Walker Morton never saw the final victory he helped achieve. On Oahu's 7th War Patrol, he penetrated the Sea of Japan through the dangerous La Perouse Strait in October 1943, attacking Japanese shipping in waters considered safe. Oahu sank 4 ships in 5 days. On October 11, 1943, while exiting the strait, Oahu was detected by Japanese aircraft and depth-charged. The submarine was lost with all 80 hands, including Morton. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who had transferred to new construction and was not aboard, survived to carry forward Morton's tactical legacy. Oahu was classified as missing and presumed lost. Morton's body, like thousands of other American submariners, was never recovered. The aggressive tactics Morton pioneered, once seen as reckless, became standard doctrine for the American submarine force. His patrol reports were studied across the Pacific, providing a blueprint for commerce warfare over vast ocean distances. Officers who learned from Morton, including O'Kane, Sam Dye on Harder, and Eugene Fluckey on Barb, accounted for a disproportionate share of Japanese shipping sunk. They proved that submarines commanded by intelligent and bold officers could achieve strategic results that entire fleets of surface ships could not. Japanese recognition of their catastrophic failure in merchant marine protection came too late. By early 1945, as American forces captured Iwo Jima and prepared to invade Okinawa, comprehensive convoy protection measures were finally implemented. Destroyers were dedicated to escort duty. Anti-submarine warfare training became mandatory, and convoy procedures were standardized. But these measures addressed a problem that had already destroyed Japan's ability to continue fighting. The merchant fleet meant to be protected had been reduced to roughly 1 million tons, a 16th of the December 1941 total. Remaining ships were coastal vessels unsuited for long-distance convoy duty, and the experienced crews were gone. The institutional knowledge was gone, and with it, the ability to sustain Japan's merchant fleet. Military historians analyzing the submarine campaign drew a broader lesson that validated strategic principles understood since antiquity. In modern industrial warfare, logistics and supply lines are decisive. Disrupting an enemy's ability to move resources can be more consequential than destroying frontline combat forces. 1,000 transport ships vanishing across thousands of miles of ocean can have a greater strategic impact than a single climactic engagement of battleships exchanging gunfire. These lessons, meticulously documented in post-war assessments by American and Japanese naval historians, shaped Cold War submarine doctrine and influenced naval strategy for decades. The memorial at Pearl Harbor honoring American submarine force casualties includes Morton's name among 3,104 officers and men who never returned. Japanese memorials in ports throughout the country list merchant sailors lost at sea, men whose deaths went largely unrecognized during the war and received minimal acknowledgement afterward. The Gato-class submarines themselves, the utilitarian vessels that executed the Pacific War's most strategically decisive campaign, were almost entirely scrapped after 1945. A handful survive today as museum ships, monuments to a campaign that demonstrated how unglamorous weapon systems, operated by disciplined volunteer crews, can achieve results that even the most expensive capital ships cannot. The story that began with Commander Morton observing a Japanese convoy through Oahu's periscope in November 1943 concluded with Japan's surrender in August 1945. The connection between those moments, between individual submarine patrols and national capitulation, illustrates how modern warfare rewards sustained, systematic pressure more than spectacular tactical victories. Japanese admirals in 1943 were stunned as American submarines began sinking merchant shipping at unprecedented rates. They were unable to adapt, trapped by institutional bias and an offensive-focused doctrine, while submarines methodically destroyed Japan's maritime economy and made further resistance materially impossible. The shock did not come from superior technology or tactics alone, but from a realization that contradicted 40 years of naval doctrine. Patient, persistent submarines could win wars that battleships and carriers could not. Thank you for watching. For more in-depth historical breakdowns, explore the other videos on your screen now.